Hi everyone and welcome back. Now in the last video we briefly covered on the topic of security assessment, and we said that the security assessment in itself is a process meant to identify the endpoints, the hosts in your network, the network topology, how the network looks like, how are they all connected, and also the services, the applications that are actually generating traffic that are running on those hosts. And we're doing all this because all these items, the network itself, the hosts, and the applications running on it, these are all the potential intrusion points in our network. So these are all the elements that make up our attack surface. This is how we are exposed in case of an attack. And of course, in order to properly determine how exposed we are, we also need to go one step further and actually analyze all those services, all those hosts for known vulnerabilities. Of course, we can only look for vulnerabilities that have been already discovered or documented by us or by someone else, right? We cannot look for something that we don't know exactly how it's supposed to look like. We don't know if a vulnerability exists in a specific piece of software unless somebody discovers it and eventually even proves that the vulnerability itself can be exploited in some way. So we're faced right now with another step in our security assessment process, and that is actually identifying, looking for those vulnerabilities in our network. So for this, we're going to have to use some dedicated software. Of course, we have to do this in an automated manner. That software has to rely on a database of known vulnerabilities so that it knows exactly what to look for and what kind of signatures to look for in there. And also, we need to rely on some sort of a scoring system. Why do we need some scoring system? Well, because in case we discover a number of vulnerabilities, let's say 10 or 100, we need some way of prioritizing them, because some of them might be more severe than others. Some of them could be postponed indefinitely. I'm not suggesting that is something you should do, but it happens. But some of them should be addressed yesterday, all right? So we need some way to prioritize these vulnerabilities once we find them. And we're going to talk about all these ideas in the next minutes. And I would like just to suggest that a good starting point, if you have no idea what you're doing, if you've perhaps never done a security assessment in your company or never worked as a security analyst before, a very good starting point would be this official NIST document, officially called Technical Guide to Information Security Testing and Assessment, blah, blah. But it can be found on Google for free as special publication 800-115. What is this? Well, it's basically a security assessments for dummies document, if you wish. It's a set of recommendation generated by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And if we scroll down to the table of contents, pretty much around this area right here, we're going to find some introductory information right here about security testing in general, review techniques, reviewing documentation, reviewing logs, reviewing rules, system configurations, and so on. Pretty much all the stuff that we've already talked about. And then we're moving on to the actual network scanning. And you're going to see this, the first step in here is target identification, which is basically a way of saying, let's see what we have in our network first before we actually start looking for vulnerabilities in there. And guess what? We're going to start with network discovery, just what we did in the previous video, right? Then we're going to move over to network port and service identification, that is identifying what type of services are running on those hosts. And then finally, we're going to be moving forward to vulnerability scanning. So we know what the hosts are, we know what they're running. Let's see if we know of any vulnerabilities that match those specific services and those specific versions. All right. We also have a specific chapter here for wireless scanning, because that's an entire separate chapter, including Bluetooth as well. And then the next chapter is about vulnerability validation. Now, this is another way of saying or of reaching into the domain of penetration testing. So we've identified the vulnerability. Let's see if it's really there, and let's see how bad could it manifest if an attacker were to exploit that vulnerability. So this is where you'll talk about password cracking and steps of penetration testing, including social engineering. I know I'm repeating myself, but social engineering is one type of attack that is almost every single time going to bypass any technical controls you might have in place. So social engineering is hacking the human, right? Tricking, coercing, threatening, rewarding a human for sharing sensitive information, all right? And at the very end, you have two chapters about security assessment. So planning and then executing the security assessment itself. And finally, some post-testing activities, mainly about reporting and remediation. So taking actions based on the actual findings of that security assessment document. All right, so pretty nifty document in here, really useful, not so long, just 80 pages long. So make sure you check it out if you're new to this field. Now, I would like to take a moment here just to clear this up. Why are we doing this security assessment business? Why are we doing all this vulnerability scanning? It's probably obvious, and the most obvious reason is perhaps the last bullet here on the screen: determining our current security posture, determining how secure we currently are. Now, this determination basically means that we need to know what exactly our weak points are. Now, those weak points, you don't have to just identify them and put them in a PDF document and forget about them. Of course not. We'll have to invest or decide what to do about them, right? If you find something that proves to be a serious vulnerability, a piece of software, a device, a type of security policy badly implemented, we probably should take some sort of action. We need to replace that device. We need to replace that control. We need to update that security policy, or we need to add some more security layers, perhaps, in order to mitigate something that cannot be mitigated with what we currently have in our network. Which leads us to the first bullet, actually. What if we did buy a security solution? We did buy something like a firewall, an intrusion detection system, a two-factor authentication system, a solution that detects abnormal behavior of users while navigating a e-commerce website. Should you at some point perhaps test whether that solution actually performs the way you expect it to perform? This is also one of the reasons behind security assessments. Testing that those solutions, those devices, those controls, the security controls, are actually behaving the way you're expecting them to behave. So you're testing what you just bought. So these are pretty much the reasons behind security scanning. When you hear security assessments, most people think about something that's mandatory. You just have to put a check mark next to it and generate a document because you just have to do it. Well, you don't really just have to do it, because there are tangible benefits for your security posture, for the integrity of your business, your applications, your data, and eventually even your employees. So we said that we're probably going to be using some sort of an automated tool for performing this type of vulnerability scanning. Now, categorizing the types of tools out there and the scanning methods, of course, it's going to lead us into a lot of categories and types of scanning, just like we're used to in all the security trainings out there. So starting with the first type of scanning, which is a network type of scan, or a network vulnerability scanner, if we think about the actual application that we're using. Now, a network vulnerability scanner is basically an application that connects over the network to the actual targets that need to be scanned. Your servers, your endpoints, your mobile devices, even your intermediary network devices like routers and switches and firewalls and IPSs and such. And over the network attempts to first make a list, make an inventory of whatever can be found in that network, make a list of active hosts and active devices, then try to identify what type of host, what type of device that is, then try to list the actual services that are running by looking at the open ports and how they are answering, all right? And then moving forward to the last phase, the actual vulnerability discovery phase. And that's going to be the most complex phase of all, because the software has to interact over the network with those services and elicit some sort of responses from those active services. That is, if you have a web server running in your network, the scanner is first going to try to reach it over port 80 or 443, right? Because those are the standard ports for HTTP. And then if it receives some sort of an answer, it's going to try to generate some sort of a directory listing perhaps, or get some banner information from that server. Maybe request some web pages and look in the actual HTTP responses to determine the type, the version of the server that is running in there. Now, once it has a pretty good understanding and a pretty good confidence about what type of server is running and what version it is, it can then match this information with a local vulnerability database, which is going to return a couple of results saying, well, for this type of Apache server and this specific version, we actually know about 10 or 12 different vulnerabilities, each with their own degree of severity. And this is the information that is going to end up in the actual security assessment report. Now, an example of a free open source vulnerability scanner application is the Greenbone Security Assistant, previously known as OpenVAS. So this is one of the most well-known tools out there for performing this type of network vulnerability scanning. You can see it relies on a database. On the left-hand side here, we can see the CVEs. This is a code for common vulnerabilities and exposures. So vulnerability codes right here. And also on the right-hand side over here, we have the network vulnerability tests. You can see it does have a pretty beefy database. By the way, this database can also be periodically updated. If we look under feed status right here, right behind my face, it's going to see that we are performing some updates on all of these databases here. And by the way, these are all being performed for free. Now, in the dashboard section here, I'm going to see a list of tasks and their status. I mean, if we go under scans, you can see that we currently have a couple of tasks. And here we have a network discovery test that I just ran, this one here, and also a vulnerability scan task that is currently running. We'll get back to this one after it has finished running. Now, so far, we can even have a peek inside of the report that is about to be generated by the scan, even though it's just 56% done. We can already see that we have a pretty high severity rating, 7.5 right here. That's because we probably found at least one high severity vulnerability in this scanning right here. If we drill down inside of this report, we can see the results tab for an overview. We can see the first vulnerability that actually generated that high severity vulnerability of score 7.5. You can see it's a report of a vulnerable cipher suit for HTTPS. So we're using some weak encryption algorithms for HTTPS. Apparently this one happens right here on my actual router from home. All right, so there's a weakness in my actual gateway that I'm using at home. Of course, we can find other types of vulnerabilities in here as well on different types of hosts in our network right here. All right. We also get a list of detected hosts, active hosts on the network. Just like we said before, the first thing a vulnerability scanner does is look for the active host because, well, if a host is not active, there's nothing to actually scan, right? Open ports, identified applications running in there, identified different operating systems. Apparently we have a generic Linux and then a Debian distribution running in there. Probably this is one of my Raspberry Pis, I think. And some common vulnerability and exposure codes right here. All right. So we'll get back to this after it's done. In the meantime, let's talk about other scanning methods. Next up, we have application scanning. Now, application scanning is a bit of a separate category, which overlaps sometimes with web application scanning because web applications are just so often found nowadays. I mean, a lot of the applications on your phone, which you think are local applications, are actually web applications or wrappers for web applications. Now, when scanning applications, the approach is a bit different because with scanning applications, we're looking for actually missing patches, missing updates, identifying weaknesses in the server code that might be exploited by a malformed client or by a compromised client. All right. And as I said before, a special category is the web application category because web applications basically include any type of website out there, any type of interactive website, and pretty much any type of website nowadays expects some sort of input from its users. So if you are allowed to provide some input, that's where all the problems begin. All right, that's where all the nasty stuff is going to come into your application and potentially exploit it. So whenever you are expecting input from your users, you have to thoroughly analyze, validate, sanitize that input because that's how exploits are being sent to your application. All right, by accepting unsanitized input. Now, a web application scanner, of course, is going to focus on the potential exploits that are specifically crafted for web applications. Now, things like cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, SQL injection. I'm going to talk about all of these later on. But for now, suffice to say that the vulnerabilities that we're looking inside of a network and into a specific service that is running on a network are completely different from the vulnerabilities that we're looking for whenever we're actually interacting with an actual application hosted perhaps behind one of those web servers that we identified with a network vulnerability scanner. So you could actually find vulnerabilities at two levels here. You could find some vulnerabilities in the actual web server, be it Apache, Nginx, IIS, whatever you're using. And then you could find a whole bunch of new vulnerabilities in the actual application code that is running on top of that web server, like WordPress or Joomla or whatever application you're running in there. And of course, we have specialized scanners for each and every one of these types of vulnerability scans. Another type of scanning, another category of scanning, and this one is a pretty simple one to understand, is active versus passive scanning. Now, the most obvious one is active scanning, where you're actually sending requests to that web server, to that web application, to that whatever type of server you're finding or what type of host you're detecting on the network, see how it reacts and see if you can determine that a specific vulnerability exists in there. That's active scanning because you're actively talking to that host in order to elicit some responses back and then determine something from those responses. At the opposite pole, we have passive scanning, which is easier to perform because it relies on capturing network traffic generated between the clients and the servers without actually interacting directly with those applications. So you're just looking at the generated traffic and try from that traffic to determine whether there are potential vulnerabilities on the server or even perhaps on the client. Now, of course, this sounds nice. It's not always as visible, doesn't provide you with that much confidence as an active type of scanning. But also, if we're talking about penetration testing, also if we're talking about an actual reconnaissance phase inside of an attack, this type of scanning is completely unintrusive. It cannot be detected. If you're just intercepting traffic and passing it over, right, without making any changes to it, just looking at the traffic, that's not something that can be detected in your network. On the other hand, if you start hitting that web server with all types of requests, trying to perform a brute force, trying to perform an SQL injection, trying to access some protected areas, trying to execute some remote code, well, those attempts are most likely going to be detected at some point because they're going to generate a lot of errors, a lot of logs, even some intrusion alerts perhaps. Now, on the other hand, passive scanning doesn't provide you with that much information because you're not allowed to actually send your own requests, but it is completely invisible. So active scanning is a type of very intrusive scanning, but that is also a next level to this. The next level of intrusion is when you're actually trying to actively exploit the vulnerabilities that you're detecting. And that type of scanning is called a penetration testing. And that also falls under the active scanning techniques. And finally, the last category of scanning is credentialed and non-credentialed type of scanning. Now, in non-credentialed, let's start with the second one, means that the scanner, the vulnerability scanner, the network scanner, simply connects over the network, attempts to generate some responses, attempts to scan the network traffic, scan the replies coming back from the application that it's scanning, but without actually having valid user accounts or user privileges to interact with the host or with the application that it attempts to scan. So it's basically behaving just like an outside user that doesn't have any kind of privileges to interact with that application or with the server that is hosting the application. Now, on the other hand, we have credential scanning, where apart from the fact that we can directly interact with the application just like a regular user, we can potentially leverage a valid user account for the application or a valid user account for the host, for the server that we're attempting to scan, so that we can actually log in, or the application scanner, the network scanner can log in into the actual target and then gather all the information regarding the running processes, running services, what versions they're running, what type of configuration files they're using, the security policies that are in place on that specific host, all kind of stuff that normally you would have to guess or to imply or to deduce or to test from the outside. So credential scan is going to provide a lot more information simply because you have access to the actual application or the host itself. You can actually view its configuration and then add that information into the security assessment report. Now, to perform a credential scan, and most vulnerability scanners out there, it's simply a process of pre-configuring a set of credentials to be used in a scanning process. In case of the Greenbow Security Assistant, we have the configuration tab right here, and then if we select credentials, right, we currently don't have any credentials, but we have a small button here on the upper left-hand corner. The interface kind of changes pretty often, so it might look different when you are attempting this. If I click this, it's going to lead me to a screen that says new credential. Can just give it a name right here, my creds, right? The type of the credentials can be a combination of a username and a password, could be a username and an SSH key, in which case I have to provide a private key right here, and perhaps even a passphrase if the private key was protected by a passphrase. I could be using a client certificate, I could be using SNMP credentials, PGP, or just a password, so on and so forth. So I can just generate a simple username and a password set right here. Let's say that I'm using something like admin with super secure password. That's what I'm writing in here. And then saving this as a set of credentials. Now, how do we use this set of credentials? We simply need to generate a new type of scan and tell the scanner to use these credentials. So under the scan menu, we select the tasks option. All right, again, we have this small, very inconspicuous button here in the upper left-hand corner that says new task. All right. Let's give it a name right here, my test scan. All right, scan targets. The scan targets section means what exactly am I going to scan? Am I going to scan a single host? Am I going to scan an entire network? Maybe a set of subnets? I already have defined an object here that says my network. By the way, you can also click on this new button here to define a new target. In this case, right here, you can, for example, add something like 192.168.15.0/24, and that's going to scan this entire subnet. Of course, you can load multiple subnets, multiple hosts from a file, and have some more options in here, like the port list. All right, how to check whether the host is alive. All right, we can do a simple ping, but we know that ping might be filtered from time to time. We can also do a TCP ACK scan, a TCP SYN scan. Remember these when we talked about Nmap? Well, pretty much the same process goes on in here when we determine whether a host is up before actually trying to scan it further, and so on and so forth. We can even consider it alive from the very beginning, right? Just trust me, it's alive, even if it's not responding. Now, apart from this, we can also check the list of ports that we need to scan. So we can perhaps define a custom list that only a specific set of ports are going to be scanned. We're only interested in a couple of applications, perhaps. And then we finally find the credentials section. So under the target, actually, when we define the scanning target, this is where we can actually tell it to use a set of credentials that we defined a minute ago. So for example, if we know that those credentials are relevant for, let's say, Windows machines, it might be an administrative account, it might be an account specifically defined and used for vulnerability scanning, we can check this SMB right here, set of credentials, and use these credentials here whenever the scanner encounters a Windows host. Identically, we can also select the credentials for SSH, for ESXi login, for SNMP, and depending on the software that you're using, of course, you might have more or less options in here. All right, so we can save this. We're back to the new tasks section in here, and we can also check the scan configuration. Now, the scan configurations are predefined for OpenVAS. Of course, you can define your own, but basically these are the settings about how many signatures are we going to use, how much scanning are we going to do actually for each and every host, how deep the scanning process is going to be. Now, full and fast is pretty much a default type of scanning. We could also do a discovery or a host discovery type of scan if we are only interested in determining the active hosts in the network, right? And you can click save. A new task right here has been created as my test scan, and you can launch it by clicking on the start with the play arrow right here on the right. And by the way, speaking about scanning configurations, you can find under the configuration menu a scan configs section, which are the predefined scanning methods that OpenVAS can use. You can see we have a discovery or a network discovery type of scanning right here. And also on the right hand side, there's the NVTs, that's the network vulnerability tests that are being performed for each and every scan type. You can see that a system discovery, for example, that simply discovers the operating systems in your network doesn't have that many tests performed in here, but something like, let's say, configuration checks for log4j, this one is an interesting one, right? It does have performed like 32,000 tests in here, or the full and fast, with an emphasis on full, it actually uses all the 99,000 NVTs available in the database. All right, you can of course define your own in here. There's a new button here in the upper left hand corner, and you can use it in your own custom scans. Now, after the scan is done, of course, you will be presented with a scan report, which is going to show you all the findings detected during that scanning process. Basically, this is going to include things such as the asset, so the item that was scanned. It might be a host, a mobile device, a server, a network device, whatever it is. The vulnerability that was discovered, identified by a code, of course, that can lead you then to read more, find out more about that specific vulnerability, which versions it applies to, if it has been fixed or not, if there is a patch or an update that you can install for it, how can it be mitigated, and finally a CVSS score. CVSS stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It's the scoring system that we talked about in the very beginning when we said that we need some way to prioritize these vulnerabilities in order to figure out which one is worse than the other, right? In order to determine where we should focus our efforts first. Okay, so this is basically a metric, right, for comparing different vulnerabilities that you can find on your system. Now, the metric itself is based on a lot of factors. It's not just something like, this one looks like a 7.5 to me, and it's definitely worse than a 5.2. All right, we actually have to reach those numbers from a number of factors that involve how easy that vulnerability is to exploit, how much privilege is required from the attacker to perform that attack, how much exposure are we risking in case the vulnerability gets exploited, and so on and so forth. We're going to have a look in a couple of slides here over all those factors that combined generate the CVSS score. So let's start with an example. And before digging into this example, let's have a look at our report that was just generated by OpenVAS and see that the CVEs that the vulnerabilities detected actually look exactly like this. So let's switch to OpenVAS and move over to our scan reports. All right, we have this vulnerability scan report, which is almost done, 98% done, but we have enough information already. So we can just open it and click on the results tab, right? This is where we're going to find all the vulnerabilities that were identified during the scanning process. You can see the vulnerability on the left-hand side, the severity. This is the actual CVSS score that we talked about, the 7.5, 6.1, and so on. Usually they're color-coded. So there's going to be something like low, medium, and high. So they pop up right away if you're just looking for some critical vulnerabilities. There's the host that the vulnerability was identified on, the location, the service that exposes this vulnerability in our case is the actual web server running on 443, so the HTTPS service on the router, and when it was detected. Now, if we drill down into this vulnerability right here, you can get a summary, detection result, detection method, what type of software is being affected, any mitigation solution that you might implement in order to fix this. And it's also going to provide some information about some links that will teach you more about the actual vulnerability and ways to mitigate it. Now, the actual code for this vulnerability is explained right here under references section. We can see we actually have 3 CVEs for the same vulnerability. Let's choose the first one, so the first occurrence. And we can see right here, this is the description of the vulnerability and the base score 7.5 and the base vector CVSS code followed by a bunch of characters in here, which we're going to discuss in just a second. Basically, all these parameters here are listed below. So that's the attack vector, attack complexity, how many privileges are required, if user interaction is required or not, and so on and so forth. Let's go back to our slide here and find out more about this. All right, so this is how a vulnerability code appears the very first time. So this is the code for a vulnerability code called CVE, Common Vulnerability and Exposures. And the first number here is going to be the year when the vulnerability was discovered, and the second one is just a number which is incremented by 1 every single time a new vulnerability is discovered. Now, the base score is going to be numerically calculated and then evaluated as low, medium, or high, and the vector basically describes all the parameters that make up this score. All right. Now, the possible scores range from 0 to 10, where 0 is no threat, starting with low, medium, and high. Everything above 9 is critical. It's something that you should address immediately. And the code itself is made up of a number of variables in here. The vector, access complexity, user interaction, scope, how much of confidentiality, integrity, and availability is being affected by exploiting this vulnerability. So how is that number actually calculated? Well, it's not that simple. But it all starts with base metrics, those base metrics that characterize that vulnerability no matter what. On top of the base metrics, we add two optional metrics. First one being the temporal ones. Temporal metrics make that vulnerability higher or lower depending on how much time has passed since that vulnerability has been discovered. Maybe in the meantime, that software has been retired. Maybe in the meantime, an update has been published. So with the passing of time, that score may actually change due to these temporal metrics. A vulnerability from 30 years ago probably is not going to be that critical nowadays. And finally, we have environmental metrics, and both of these are optional. Environmental metrics are the metrics that apply to your own environment. So there are things that depend on how that specific software that had the vulnerability is implemented in your environment. Because in your environment, perhaps a web server is completely isolated from any outside network, is air-gapped, for example. In that case, a vulnerability in that web server that can only be exploited over the internet is something that doesn't apply to you, doesn't apply to your environment, because it simply cannot be reached from the internet. So we have some metrics in here. We have the base ones, we have the temporal metrics, which take into account how much time has passed and what has happened in the meantime, and environmental metrics that take into account your own environment, your own network. All right, so starting with the base metrics, we're first going to be looking at the attack vector, which can be network, adjacent, local, or physical. Let's see what that means. Well, if we head over to the CVSS specification document, which is one way of saying read the manual, all right? I'm going to scroll down here. You can see the base metrics that we just talked about, the temporal metric groups, and the environmental metrics. So you can see I wasn't lying before when I told you that these metrics are actually all calculated together. So this is the scoring, and finally we start with the base metrics. We have the exploitability metrics, right? The first one being the attack vector. The attack vector is the network requirement for the attack to be successful, which basically means that it can be performed over the network. It has to be performed in an adjacent network, like the attack is limited at the protocol level to a logically adjacent topology. So for example, this can mean an attack must be launched from the same shared physical network or logical network, which is completely different from a network attack vector, which can also include the entire internet. All right, so adjacent means it has to be next to or at least part of the same subnet. Next one is local. This one says that it is not bound to the network stack, so it doesn't have to be performed over the network, but it means that the attacker must be able to access the system locally, like a keyboard or a console, or remotely over SSH. Or the attacker might rely on some user interaction by coercing or tricking another person into performing these actions. And finally, we have the physical vector, which requires the attacker to physically touch or manipulate the vulnerable component. So of course, depending on the score of this one is going to increase or decrease the actual criticality of our attack vector. Next one, we have attack complexity. Simple enough, low or high. Attack complexity, low or high. If we scroll down here, low means, well, we don't really need specialized access conditions. By the way, this one right here, low is bad, right? So the attack complexity doesn't require any kind of prerequisites in order for it to be successful. So in attack complexity, required attack complexity is low. This one is going to increase your CVSS score. On the other hand, if the attack complexity is high, this one means that a successful attack depends on conditions beyond the attacker's control. So it takes a little more work from the attacker's point of view in order to successfully conduct an attack like this. So the attacker must gather knowledge about the environment, must be able to prepare the target environment, or must inject themselves into the logical network path between the target and the resource requested by the victim. So it has to perform some sort of a man in the middle. So it does take some work. Sometimes this type of work is close to impossible. So this is high. This is why an attack complexity of high is actually not that worrisome. Next up, we have privileges. How many privileges are required by the attacker to successfully conduct this attack? None, low, or high. Let's see a brief description of these as well. None doesn't require any access to settings or files of the vulnerable system to carry out an attack. Again, none is the most dangerous one. If it doesn't require any privileges, it means that pretty much anyone can perform that attack, which is the worst case, right? Low privileges, it might require that the attacker can impersonate some basic user, a regular user. Now, of course, on the other hand, we have high privileges that require an attacker to have administrative control over the exploited device or the exploited system. What's next? User interaction. Does the attack require no user interaction or some user interaction? All right, the vulnerable system can be exploited without interaction from any user. Again, this is bad. Okay, you don't rely on anything else in order to conduct the attack or anybody else, or required because the successful exploitation requires a user to take some action, such as clicking a malicious link, downloading some file, executing some files, inserting a USB stick with malware on it, any kind of action performed by a user. Of course, if it requires the user interaction, then the complexity increases and then the score decreases because it's less likely for that attack to succeed, at least when you compare it with a situation where there is no user interaction required to successfully conduct that attack. Then we move over to the scope. And the scope basically means whether the attack can impact other components outside the intended target. So is the scope unchanged? That is, if I'm targeting a specific target, that's the only target that gets affected, or changed if other entities are going to be affected as well. You can probably guess which one is worse than the other, right? So unchanged means that exploited vulnerability can only affect resources managed by the same security authority. Pretty complicated way of saying that you're not affecting any other resources. While changed means that we are actually affecting other resources as well. And finally, we have the impact metrics. How are we impacted from a confidentiality perspective, integrity perspective, or availability perspective if that vulnerability gets exploited? And you can probably guess what high, low, or none means for each and every one of these. For example, for confidentiality, high means a total loss of confidentiality resulting in all resources being divulged to the attacker. So the attacker gains access to all the privileged information. While low might be, for example, that there is some loss of confidentiality, but the attacker, for example, doesn't have control over what information is obtained. So it can get some information, it just doesn't have a choice into what exactly is it going to get in return for a successful attack. And of course, no loss of confidentiality means that the vulnerability doesn't disclose any confidential data, right? The same goes for integrity and availability. Basically, a high loss of availability is the equivalent of a denial of service attack. So bringing down the application, bringing down the service, making it unusable, while a low availability impact means that just the performance is impacted, is reduced. You're going to get some annoyed users that complain that the service is low, but the service is still going to be available. Next up, we have the temporal metrics, which we can talk about here. And these include the exploit code maturity. Is there an exploit code already developed for this specific vulnerability? If there is no exploit code available or that we know about, then of course the score is not going to be so high because the risk is not so high for somebody to actually use that exploit code and exploit the vulnerability. Remediation level, as you can probably guess, is there a patch? Is there an update, a fix that we can install to remediate this vulnerability? Not defined, that is, it doesn't apply. You cannot have a patch that can address this vulnerability. Unavailable just yet. We might have a workaround, better than nothing. We might have a temporary fix, or we might have an official fix. All right. Now, report confidence. If we scroll down here, again in the official documentation, report confidence means how much can we trust the actual existence of this vulnerability. Like detailed reports exist or a functional reproduction is possible. We can at every moment in time demonstrate that this vulnerability exists and it can be exploited. Or reasonable, like we have some details published but the research hasn't been fully completed. Finally, we have the environmental metric, right? The last one right here, security requirements. As we said before, this one applies to your own environment. So a definition for this, actually, it's a pretty good one right here in the official documentation that says that the environmental metrics and especially the security requirements, confidentiality, integrity, and availability enable us to tweak the CVSS score depending on the importance of the affected IT asset to a user's organization. How important the loss of confidentiality, integrity or availability is to us. So for example, it means that a loss of C or I or A is likely to have a catastrophic adverse effect on the organization or on the individuals associated with the organization, like your employees or your customers. Same goes for the other levels in here. All right, so now if we go back to the example from before, that CVE that we looked into, you can see that the vector now can kind of make sense, right? We have an attack vector of network, have an attack complexity of low, we have privileges required none, we have user interaction required, we have a scope, we have an impact of C and I and an A, right? So this is what that vector actually means. So moving back to our vulnerability scanner, we can actually read this base vector now with different eyes, right? And then understand what exactly is going on within all these metrics that make up that 7.5 CVSS score. Now, of course, you don't really need to know the exact formula that goes into calculating this. It's going to take like 5 seconds to search it on Google, but it's not going to be required for the exam anyway. Now, I know I've mentioned this before, but there's another big source of vulnerabilities, and that's the source where we don't blame the developers, but we should blame the network admin or the sysadmins. And that's the place where vulnerabilities stem from bad configurations. You have the firewall in place, you have all the functionality available in there, you have all the security methods that you can enable, you just don't enable them. Or you just enable them in a way that is too permissive and opens yourself to other attacks. And that's why it's part of a security assessment or a vulnerability scan. A big part of it is the review of the configurations of your servers, of your network devices, even of the security policies installed on your host. You can find things in here such as security policies not enabled at all, too permissive security policies, updates not being performed for intrusion detection, for antivirus solutions, password policies that allow users to set passwords such as 123 that are immediately broken and and your account get immediately compromised. So configuration vulnerabilities can be done as a configuration scan or configuration vulnerability scan. Now, of course, in order to access the configurations on your host or your network devices, the type of scanning that you need to perform is going to be a credentialed scan. You probably guessed this, right? Because otherwise you don't have access to the configuration files or the security policies that are deployed on that host. You need to read the actual file, you need to read the actual security policy, the group policy that is being configured on that host in order for you to be able to determine if there's something misconfigured in there. And we have some methods of automating this. One of them being the SCAP protocol, the Security Content Automation Protocol. This one is a standard protocol used by scanners to determine whether a workstation, an endpoint, matches a well-known predefined configuration that we agreed on. So normally when you start looking for misconfigurations, you need to have some sort of a baseline. You need to have a predefined model, an ideal configuration that you can share with your vulnerability scanner and tell it, try to match the configurations that you find on these hosts with this ideal baseline and see if there are any discrepancies in there, if there's something that doesn't match. Otherwise, the vulnerability scanner is going to have a very limited view as to what is right and what is wrong, what should be in there, what shouldn't be in there, because it has nothing to compare it to. So you need to start with a valid baseline. And one of the methods for describing that baseline is by using the language called OVAL, Open Vulnerability and Assessment Language, which is just an XML type of file that describes your ideal baseline. It describes your system security policies, describes how your configuration should look like, and what are the elements that a vulnerability scanner should be on the lookout for. And also on this chapter, we have XCCDF, Extensible Configuration Checklist Description Format. All right. Remember that one. Now you just have to remember the acronym here, but this one is another XML standard for XML type of file actually for describing best practices or checklists for providing that security baseline. So this is basically a file that means look for this item, make sure it's in this state. Look for this item, make sure it's in this state, right? If everything checks out, then you get a 100% score at the end of it. You're pretty sure that the configuration, the security configuration matches the baseline and you're good to go. And by the way, these methods of automatically comparing your configurations with predefined baselines can be simplified a lot especially using commercial software such as Nessus, because such products come pre-packaged with predefined baselines for what a web server should look like, what's configuration for a web server should look like, what's the configuration for an Microsoft SQL database server should look like, and stuff like that. So you don't really have to try to write these configurations by hand, line by line, in order to validate your security configurations, right? You can already get some validated templates, but in most cases, these come pre-packaged in commercial software. And also, these types of software usually include specialized scanning types called compliance scans. So, for example, if you are facing an audit, if you're running an online business that processes credit card information, you might be interested to see whether your infrastructure matches the PCI DSS requirements for payment card industry. Now, you could, of course, manually try to validate every single requirement of the PCI DSS standard requirements, or you could use a predefined template on a commercial scanner such as Nessus that is going to automatically validate all those fields for you. And in just a matter of minutes, it's going to return to you a report saying this is where you're compliant and this is where you're not compliant, and also give you some recommendations as to what you might need to improve. Similar compliance scans could be done, for example, for GDPR, for personal identifiable information. How are you protecting or how are you processing personal identifiable information? Or let's say HIPAA, right, for medical records and so on. Automated scanners are not perfect. Of course, they sometimes generate errors, but the errors that they generate are actually, let's say, small white lies, which are called false negatives and false positives. Now, false positive, let's start with the second one. A false positive means that a vulnerability that is found is not actually there or is not relevant to you, which is not that bad, right? Because we're identifying something, it just takes us a little while to determine it. At the worst, we're just wasting some time, right, to determine that the vulnerability that we see in the report, actually, we don't care about it. It doesn't apply to us. Now, the unfortunate situation is where the scanner returns a false negative. And actually, it's not going to return a false negative. It's not going to return anything. A false negative means that there is a vulnerability in there that the scanner did not catch. And of course, it's not going to be included in the report. It's the absence of that vulnerability in the report that we call a false negative. Now, what can you do against false negatives? Think about the situation where you're running an antivirus scan. You know if a file is infected, but the antivirus doesn't report it as infected. What do? Well, you could probably try scanning it with a different antivirus solution, right? That's exactly what you could do in the vulnerability scanning world as well. You could try multiple vulnerability scanners on the same network, on the same topology, see if those results match. Right? Some of them might catch some vulnerabilities, some of them might not. On the other hand, you could, of course, keep your signatures, your vulnerability signatures up to date. That's something that you should always do before attempting a new scan. And at the very end of the day, you could try to enhance those vulnerability results with some other source of information. You could try manually analyzing some suspicious hosts that you might just think that are not behaving the way they should be behaving, right? Analyze running processes in there. Let's see if they've generated some traffic with some unknown destinations, maybe potentially bad reputation destinations out there, right? Things like that. If you suspect that there's more out there that the vulnerability scanner doesn't detect, maybe you should investigate. Trust your gut from time to time. All right, so how can you avoid these false results? Well, there's not that much you can do about false results. But for example, let's make sure that the scanner is being performed correctly. So we're not missing anything. We're not missing a big part of the network because we might be filtering the actual scanning traffic. If you're performing a network-wide scan, you should probably temporarily disable all those intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems that you might have in there, because a vulnerability scan looks awfully like the reconnaissance phase before an attack, and it's going to raise some flags, going to raise some alarms. You have some IPSs in there, they might try to block your scanning traffic, and your report will be incomplete. So make sure that your scanning traffic is allowed and is not filtered by any security devices in your network. Other than that, try to perform credential scan whenever it's possible, because it's going to provide you with a lot more usable and useful information about the systems and the services that are running in your network. You're not going to be able to view the active processes, or you're not going to be able to view the actual configuration files if you're not performing a credential type of scan. Now, you might determine that your scanning software needs some fine-tuning. Maybe it's going to constantly alert you about some vulnerabilities that don't apply to your environment. Maybe you need to remove those from the actual vulnerability database. Or you might have to fine-tune it because some services respond very slowly, right? And the vulnerability scanner is a bit more impatient. So there are a lot of tweaks, fine-tuning techniques that you can perform in each vulnerability scanner that can better match the way your environment behaves. If you're performing configuration scanning, make sure that the baseline you're comparing those configurations to is okay and is up to date. A baseline created 5 years ago might not apply today. So make sure you invest some research, invest some effort into maintaining those baselines up to date, because those are the baselines that you're going to be comparing all your security policies all over the network to. And finally, make sure that a result, no matter how scary it looks like in that vulnerability report, actually applies to your network. You might be receiving some vulnerabilities that were mistakenly identified as affecting some of your, let's say, IIS web servers in your network. And if you think about it for a second, you realize, I don't have any Windows servers in my networks. How could I have an IIS vulnerability? Well, first you should probably investigate just to make sure that nobody is running some virtual machines, running Windows server that you might not know nothing about. And also think about the fact that many of these scanning methods, especially the uncredentialed scanning methods, rely on some very fine type of information that can be deduced from the network traffic, from the way the server behaves, from the way the server answers, in order to determine what type of service is running in there and what type of application is behind that open port. Sometimes vulnerability scanners make mistakes and mistakenly identify something that is an Nginx server, web server, as an IIS web server, right? Simply because it's configured a bit atypical perhaps. So make sure you're validating those results. Don't just trust them blindly. Make sure they actually apply to real resources, hosts, applications, and versions that can be found in your environment, in your network. And, well, here's a bit of a good news. Well, at the end of the day, think about, well, I did find this vulnerability. Is it worth the effort? Is it really that critical? Does it really put me up to that much risk so that we need to actively invest time, effort, and money into fixing it? Think about that. There's going to be a lot of vulnerabilities, of low score vulnerabilities out there that you're going to read, you're going to see that it's there, and you're going to say like, meh, it's okay. I don't really care about that one, right? Let's leave it right there. Maybe next time we'll just do a massive update of all our web servers in our server farm, and probably that one is going to be fixed as well. But really don't care if somebody exploits that minor vulnerability. Now, I'm not saying be lazy about this, of course, but try to focus your efforts on what really matters. Word of advice for life as well. All right, so that's it about vulnerability scanning and results. I would strongly encourage you to play at least with OpenVAS because it's available for free. Install it in a Docker container if you wish. I'm going to provide you with the Docker command and the repository you can install it from in the video description. You can play with it for free. Keep in mind that it takes a long time to boot up because it's going to need to update its vulnerability databases and all the databases that it relies on. So don't be impatient, give it some time to boot up. Other than that, if you want to continue discussing on this topic, leave a message in the comment section if you enjoyed this, if you liked this, if you found it useful. Like and subscribe. Good luck on the exam, and see you on the next video. Bye-bye.